The whole world watched Grace Kelly get married. It was April of 1956, and 30 million Americans tuned in to see the golden girl from Philadelphia become a real-life princess. She stepped off an ocean liner in the harbor of Monaco, with 2 poodles, 3 tons of luggage, and the most photographed wedding gown of the 20th century. She walked down the aisle of the St. Nicholas Cathedral and gave her hand to Prince Rainier III. She became, in that single afternoon, one of the most famous women alive. What almost no one knew, and what she would not admit to more than a handful of people until the end of her life, was that Grace Kelly had made a mistake. She had traded the career of a lifetime for a marriage she was not sure of, in a country she did not know, to a man she barely understood. And she would spend the next 26 years, until the day she died on a mountain road above Monaco, quietly grieving the life she gave up. Tonight, we are going to tell you the story of Grace Kelly. Not the fairy tale, the other story, the one behind the tiara. To understand the woman, you have to understand the family she came from. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She was the third of 4 children in one of the most powerful Irish Catholic families in America. Her father, John B. Kelly Sr., was a self-made millionaire. He had grown up poor, become an Olympic gold medal rower, and built a brick contracting empire that made him one of the richest men in Pennsylvania. Her mother, Margaret, had been the first woman to coach women's athletics at the University of Pennsylvania. Her brother, John Jr., would go on to win Olympic bronze in rowing himself. This was a family of winners, of champions, of people who succeeded at everything they touched. And Grace, from the very beginning, did not fit in. She was the quiet one, the dreamy one, the shy middle child who read too much and blushed too easily. Her father, the great John Kelly, made no secret of the fact that Grace was not his favorite. He preferred her older sister Peggy, who was athletic and loud and confident. He once said, right to a magazine reporter, that Grace was the one he never quite understood. Imagine growing up in that house. Imagine being told, in 100 small ways, that you were the disappointment. It shaped her. It shaped everything. By the time she was 18, Grace had decided she was going to be an actress. Her father was furious. In the Kelly family, actresses were one small step above the streetwalker. Respectable Philadelphia girls did not go to New York to put on makeup and pretend for a living. But Grace, who was quiet in almost every other way, refused to back down on this one. She enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in Manhattan. She lived in a women's residence hotel. She worked as a model to pay her way, appearing in advertisements for toothpaste and cigarettes. And she was, by all accounts, absolutely lovely. Not in the pin-up way that Hollywood was pushing at the time. Not the platinum blonde bombshell that Marilyn Monroe was becoming. Grace was different. She was cool. She was contained. She looked like the girl next door, if the girl next door had gone to finishing school. She had that quality that Hitchcock would later call his icy blonde, the woman who looks perfectly composed on the outside, while something entirely different is happening underneath. Her first big break came in 1952, in a western called High Noon opposite Gary Cooper. She was only 22. Cooper, who was one of the biggest stars in the world, took one look at her and said she was going to be the next great American actress. He was not wrong. Over the next 4 years, Grace Kelly would make 11 films. She would win an Academy Award. She would work with the greatest directors of her era. She would become one of the most sought-after leading ladies in Hollywood. And she would fall in love, quietly and privately, with the wrong men, over and over again. Grace's love life during her Hollywood years was, to put it mildly, complicated. She had a habit of falling for her co-stars, and her co-stars, almost every single one of them, fell for her back. There was Ray Milland during Dial M for Murder in 1954. Milland was in his late 40s. He was married. Grace was 24. The affair was intense, brief, and painful. When his wife found out, the whole thing exploded, and Grace fled the fallout deeply shaken. There was Bing Crosby during The Country Girl, the film that would win her the Oscar. Crosby, recently widowed, fell hard for Grace. He proposed marriage. She said no. There was William Holden during The Bridges at Toko-Ri, also married, also very much in love with her. There was Clark Gable during Mogambo in Africa, though the great Gable, 30 years her senior, seems to have been more paternal than romantic. And there was Oleg Cassini, the dashing fashion designer, who pursued her for over a year and to whom she was, at one point, engaged. It was Cassini that Grace loved most, according to friends who knew her best in those years. She wanted to marry him. She almost did. She met his family. She wore his ring. She talked, in private letters, about the small apartment in New York they were going to make their home. And it was John B. Kelly Sr., her formidable father, who put a stop to it. Cassini was divorced. Cassini was not Catholic. Cassini, in the old Philadelphia phrase, was not one of us. John Kelly forbid the marriage. He told Grace, in a scene that her sister Peggy later described, that if she went ahead with Cassini, she would no longer be welcome in the Kelly home, and Grace, dutiful daughter that she still was, gave Cassini up. She wrote him a letter that he kept for the rest of his life. Cassini never fully recovered from her. He would say, decades later, that Grace was the great love of his life, and that everything he did after her was a kind of consolation prize. It broke her heart, too. It was one of the great regrets of her life. And it left her, at 25 years old, single, famous, exhausted, and quietly wondering if she was ever going to find a life that felt like her own. In April of 1955, Grace traveled to the Cannes Film Festival to represent the United States. It was there, in a small photo opportunity arranged by a French magazine, that she was introduced to a short, dark-haired man in a dark suit. His name was Rainier Louis-Henri Maxence Bertrand Grimaldi. He was the sovereign prince of a tiny principality on the French Riviera called Monaco. The meeting was brief. It was awkward. Grace was, by her own later admission, not particularly impressed. Rainier was polite but formal. They exchanged pleasantries. She toured his palace gardens. She left, thinking he was pleasant enough and nothing more. What she did not know was that Rainier had been looking for a wife. His country needed an heir. Under an old treaty with France, if he did not produce a legitimate child, Monaco would revert to French control. He was 32 years old, unmarried, and running out of time. And Grace Kelly, the Oscar-winning American actress, who was also a devout Catholic from a wealthy family, was, on paper, exactly what he needed. Over the next several months, letters began to arrive at Grace's New York apartment. Long, thoughtful letters from Rainier. They exchanged photographs. They spoke on the telephone. By Christmas of 1955, Rainier had traveled to Philadelphia to meet the Kelly family. And it was at the Kelly family Christmas dinner, according to Grace's own later accounts, that Rainier proposed. 3 days after they had seen each other for only the second time in their lives, Grace said yes. She would say, decades later, that she did not know why. She would say that she had been tired, that she had felt trapped in Hollywood, that her father had been pleased for the first time in her memory, and that the idea of becoming a princess had felt, in that moment, like an escape. She did not love Rainier, not yet. She barely knew him, but she said yes. And once John B. Kelly Sr. had shaken hands with a prince, there was no turning back. The wedding, when it came in April of 1956, was one of the most watched events of the 20th century. It was the first true global media wedding, broadcast to over 30 million people. Grace wore a gown designed by Helen Rose of MGM, given to her as a wedding gift by the studio, made of 25 yards of silk taffeta and 125-year-old rose point lace. She looked, on that day, like every little girl's dream of a princess. But those who were closest to her saw something else. Her closest friend from Hollywood, the costume designer Edith Head, later said that Grace, on her wedding day, looked like a woman going to her own execution. Her sister Peggy noticed how quiet Grace was in the days before the ceremony, how she stopped eating, how she cried in private and pretended she had not been crying when anyone came into the room. MGM, her studio, had negotiated an unusual clause into her marriage agreement. They wanted the right to continue making films with her after the wedding. Rainier had, at first, agreed. Grace believed she was going to have both, the prince and the career. She would keep making movies. She would be a working princess. That was the deal. That was, she thought, why she had said yes. Within weeks of the wedding, the deal fell apart. Rainier informed her that no, actually, she would not be making any more films. It was not appropriate for the Princess of Monaco. Her films that had already been made were, in fact, banned from being shown in Monaco. Her own citizens were not permitted to see her work. She was 26 years old, at the absolute peak of her career, and she had just been quietly, firmly told that her career was over. The years that followed were, on the surface, everything a fairy tale should be. Grace gave Rainier 3 children in 5 years. Princess Caroline, born in 1957. Prince Albert, born in 1958. Princess Stephanie, born in 1965. She threw herself into motherhood. She learned French. She learned the protocols and the etiquette of a European royal court. She hosted charity balls. She founded a children's aid organization. She became, by every visible measure, an exemplary princess. But her friends from the old life noticed things. She wrote letters to Hollywood friends that grew, over the years, more melancholy. She missed acting. She missed her craft. She missed the specific pleasure of being on a set, of solving the puzzle of a character, of doing the work she had been born to do. And Rainier was not, it turned out, an easy man to be married to. He was moody. He was possessive. He was not particularly interested in her opinions on matters of state. Their marriage, according to sources close to the palace, had periods of real difficulty, periods when they lived on separate floors of the palace and communicated mostly through staff. Grace grew heavier. She dressed more conservatively. She smoked, quietly, in private, and she waited, though she may not have known she was waiting, for a chance to go back to the life she had left. That chance came in 1962. It came from Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock had directed Grace in 3 of her best films, Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief. He had been, in his own strange way, in love with her. He had spoken about her in interviews for years after she left Hollywood, always with a kind of longing that other people found uncomfortable. He had never found another actress who did for him what Grace did. He had tried. He had directed other blonde leading ladies, and each of them had been, in some way, a substitute. But none of them were her, and when she had left for Monaco, he had never quite gotten over it. In 1962, Hitchcock offered Grace a role. It was a psychological thriller called Marnie. The part was extraordinary, a beautiful, troubled young woman who is a compulsive thief and who cannot bear to be touched. It was the kind of role that could have redefined Grace as a serious dramatic actress. It was darker than anything she had done before. It required real depth. Hitchcock had written the letter offering it to her personally, and he had made clear that he had waited 7 years for her to be ready to come back. And Grace, according to everyone who spoke to her at that time, wanted it desperately. She said yes. She and Rainier discussed it, at length, in the palace at Monaco. He agreed. He gave his blessing. He told her that she deserved this, that she had given so much to Monaco, that she should have this one thing back. Announcements were made. Hitchcock began pre-production. Grace began preparing the role, reading the script over and over, marking her pages. She spoke, in a rare moment, to a friend on the telephone, and said she felt alive for the first time in years. And then the people of Monaco found out. There was outrage. The local newspapers ran headlines about how their princess was going to abandon them to go back to Hollywood and play a thief. Church leaders spoke against it. Politicians spoke against it. Letters flooded the palace. Rainier, who had said yes, now had to say no. He came to Grace, according to her later accounts, and told her that she could not do the film, that the country would not stand for it, that she had a duty. Grace begged him. She argued. She wept. But she knew, in the end, that she had no choice. A princess who defied her own country would not be a princess for long. Grace pulled out of Marnie. She wrote a letter to Hitchcock explaining her situation, thanking him, apologizing. It was one of the most difficult letters she ever wrote. She cried, her friends said, for weeks. She stayed in her rooms in the palace for days at a time. She barely ate. It was the closest she had come, since her wedding day, to admitting to herself what she had given up. Hitchcock cast Tippi Hedren in her place. He would treat Hedren notoriously badly on the set of Marnie and the film they made after it. A bitterness that many in Hollywood believed was really about Grace, about the woman he could not have back. And Grace Kelly, at 33 years old, quietly closed the door on the life she had loved most. She never made another film, not because she did not want to, because she was not allowed to. The last 20 years of Grace's life were marked by a slow, growing sadness that only her closest friends could see. She continued to be, in public, the perfect princess. She was gracious. She was elegant. She was, in every photograph, the woman the world expected her to be. But her letters to old friends became more searching. She wrote about missing Hollywood. She wrote about wondering what her life would have been if she had made different choices. She wrote, in one letter from the late 1970s, that she felt she had lost herself somewhere along the way. She threw herself into poetry readings, giving performances of readings across Europe and America. It was the closest she could get to acting. It was, according to friends, both a comfort and a reminder of what she was missing. Her marriage to Rainier stabilized as they grew older. There was affection between them. There was respect. But there had never, according to those who knew them both, been the great romantic love of the fairy tale. It had been a partnership, a working arrangement, and Grace had honored it, faithfully, for 26 years. Her children were her greatest joy and, at times, her greatest heartbreak. Caroline married young, badly, and divorced. Stephanie was a rebellious teenager who worried her mother constantly. Albert struggled with the weight of being the future prince. Grace loved all three of them fiercely. She protected them. She tried, in ways her own father had never tried with her, to see them for who they were, rather than who she wanted them to be. On the morning of September 13, 1982, Grace was driving down a winding mountain road from her country home at Rock Eagle back to Monaco. Her daughter Stephanie, then 17, was in the passenger seat. It was a road Grace had driven 100 times. She knew every turn. But on that morning, something went wrong. Witnesses saw the car begin to swerve, then accelerate, then plunge off the road and down a steep embankment. The car rolled multiple times before coming to rest. Stephanie was pulled from the wreckage alive but badly injured. Grace was found unconscious in the driver's seat. She was rushed to a hospital in Monaco. Doctors discovered that she had suffered 2 strokes. One appears to have happened at the wheel, causing her to lose control of the car. The other happened after the crash, likely brought on by the trauma. Grace never regained consciousness. She was taken off life support the following day, September 14, 1982. She was 52 years old. The world grieved. Monaco went into deep mourning. President Reagan sent condolences. Nancy Reagan and Diana, Princess of Wales, attended the funeral. Rainier was inconsolable. He would live for another 23 years and never remarry, saying only, once, that Grace had been the love of his life. Whether she would have said the same about him is a question no one can now answer. In the years since her death, biographers and friends have pieced together a fuller picture of Grace's inner life. The letters have surfaced. The interviews have been given. Her close friend, Judith Balaban Quine, wrote a book about the 6 bridesmaids from her wedding, and what became of each of their marriages. And Grace's is not a happy chapter. Her son Albert has spoken with unusual honesty about his mother's homesickness for America. Her daughter Stephanie has spoken about the sadness she saw in her mother in the last years. And Grace herself, in one interview given a few years before her death, said something that still stops people when they read it today. She said, "My life did not turn out the way I thought it would." She did not elaborate. She did not have to. Everyone who knew her understood. Grace Kelly gave up Hollywood for a prince. She traded the Academy Award and the future films and the career she had built for a crown, a country, and a marriage arranged in 3 days at a Christmas dinner in Philadelphia. And she paid for that trade, quietly and privately, for the rest of her life. She was one of the most beautiful women who ever lived. She was one of the most photographed. She was, on paper, one of the luckiest. But she was not, in her own private heart, one of the happiest. And that is the fuller truth behind the fairy tale. If you are old enough to remember watching her wedding, you remember thinking she had everything. If you saw her films, you know what the world lost when she stopped making them. And if you are one of the many women who ever wondered what your life might have been if you had made a different choice at 26, then Grace Kelly's story is, in a strange and quiet way, your story too. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If Grace's story moved you, please leave a comment below and share a memory. Which Grace do you remember best? The elegant blonde in Rear Window, the tender young wife in The Country Girl, the bride waving from the balcony in Monaco. Whichever Grace lives in your memory, she deserves to be remembered. And if you would like more stories like this one, please subscribe. There are many more stories to tell. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and remember that behind every fairy tale, there is a real woman who was quietly, humanly, alive. Good night.